too much coffee, not enough sleep, and I have too many slides. So set your expectations. And I will say, the last time I visited Leipzig and UFZ was 8 years ago, and I had my daughter with me. She was in 7th grade, and now she's about ready to graduate college, and she wants to get a PhD in linguistics and become a professor. So that's how much time has gone. And we haven't aged, only our children age. All right, so when I first came in 2006, I was finishing up my book, The Honest Broker. Some of you will have heard of it, some of you haven't. I'll go over some of that today. I'm nearing completion of the sequel, which is called The Honest Broker in Practice. I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of positive, a lot of critique of the book. And one thing people say is, well, all right, this is a nice theoretical framework, but what do we do with it? So that's why I have the title, The Honest Broker in Practice. So what I'd like to do in the time I have available, and I will say this is work in progress, there's so much to talk about, is to talk about the challenges and opportunities for assuming the different roles between expertise and decision-making that are described in the book in a little bit more practical detail. One thing, and this may just reflect my thinking has become frozen, but the framework of The Honest Broker seems to have held up pretty well. In the sequel, I don't change the overall framework, and I'll explain that to you shortly. And I'm just going to hit what I think are some highlights. It's not comprehensive, and when we have our panel discussion, I'll be happy to talk in more detail. So the Honest Broker framework, there's a theoretical background, and there's a lot more detail than I'll get into here. I will say that the cover of the book is a frieze from Siena, and it's called The Allegory of Good Government. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today is the idea that when we use technical terms like science policy, interface, or connecting science and decision-making, but what we're really doing, and I'll point to this, is we are participating in shaping democracy and democratic practices. And there's an inherent tension in democracy between experts, those of us who think we know a lot about a certain subject, and policymaking, which involves often elected officials who may or may not be experts, who are elected by the general population, most of whom are not experts. And in democratic systems, we have this funny idea that people have a right to have some influence over how they're governed. It's not expertise by governance by experts. So I'm going to quickly go through these categories just to give people unfamiliar with them. Some of you have seen this maybe too many times. I lost a slide there. All right, so let's say I come to Leipzig, and I arrive, let's say yesterday, and I'm hungry and I need to find a place to eat dinner. I'm a decision maker, you're the expert, you're the local. What are the different ways that our interaction might occur? So first, pure science. You might say, oh, I found on the internet, there's this document, Dietary Guidelines for Americans. You're an American, this is from the Food and Drug Administration. It doesn't tell you where to eat, it just gives you the facts. Here's the information you need to know. We can all think about the problems with, like, where are the restaurants and how might I eat? But there is this idea that one role that we have is just to do our research, not to try to influence policy. Science arbiter. This is a little bit like the concierge at my hotel. So we could have a very structured interaction. I could go to the concierge and say, could you tell me where the closest restaurant where I can get a schnitzel is? And they would say here, here, and here. And it's a structured interaction between a decision maker who has information needs and an expert who provides that information. The issue advocate wants you to make a choice in a particular direction. So you might say, oh, you must like McDonald's, so here's a map of all the local McDonald's. The point here isn't that you're giving false or misleading information, but the issue advocate seeks to compel a particular decision, a particular outcome. The honest broker of policy alternatives. One of the things I realized upon the reception of my book is that people read honest broker and they stopped with the word honest. And the action actually is in broker of policy alternatives. The key here is that instead of telling me where I should go, you give me choices to where I might go. You empower me to make a decision. So the example would be a travel guide of sorts. This is complicated. There's some details. We'll get into that. There's one more category. This is stealth issue advocacy. We know this as the so-called deficit model of science, the idea where we experts have a preference. We want decision makers to act a certain way, and we say, yo, I just deal in facts. I'm not trying to influence your decision, but we really are trying to compel. So we present ourselves as a pure scientist or a science arbiter, but what we're really secretly doing is trying to compel a particular outcome. This is different than overt advocacy. If I say, I'd like to shut down coal power plants in Germany, that's overt advocacy. But if I say, the science says you have to shut down coal power plants in Germany, that's stealth issue advocacy. I'll get into some of the details. So what I'm going to do throughout the time I have available is just walk through each of these categories and talk about some of the interesting practical aspects about conducting these issues. And I'll go quickly, and as my time slowly goes away, I'll skip and jump around. But so the pure scientist. One of the things I did in a research project not long ago was to try to find out where did this term, this English language phrase, basic research, come from. There's some German terms for the same concepts. Because basic research has shaped, particularly in the United States, post-World War II science policy. There's a lot of invocation of the importance, and it's still important. But it dates to about 100 years ago. The first time it appeared before the US Congress was exactly 100 years ago. The first president to use the term was 1946. What's interesting is basic research, when it first appeared as a term, it meant applied research. It didn't mean basic research. And this is from the US Department of Agriculture, and the first phrase was, the basic work of the department is in the field of research. The Department of Agriculture in the United States doesn't do research for research's sake. It does research for practical sake. Somewhere along the line, and there's a whole story here, basic research became a political concept used by us researchers to justify not having policymakers interfere in our work. So this is in the journal Science and Nature. If you look at the mentions of basic research, it basically peaks about the time I got my PhD. And really, in the 25 years since then, we don't see as much appeal to basic research. And we see this in the United States, we see this in Europe, we see this elsewhere. Everyone in here who has ever written a proposal for research funding knows that if you say, give me some money, I'm going to go explore some interesting topics, has no relevance, no economic impact, no societal relevance, it's not going to go very far. We live in an era where research is expected to have impact, and impact not just on our colleagues, but on the real world. So I would say that the notion of pure science, the pure researcher, it's quaint, it's nice, but it's not particularly relevant to our era. We are expected to have impact. The science arbiter. So Dan Sarowitz at Arizona State University and we wrote a paper after we had a big $5 million NSF research project basically on science policy interfaces related to climate research. And we summarized what we were doing with a simple 2x2 matrix. Don't let anyone fool you. The complexity of the world can be described entirely by a 2x2 matrix. We call this the missed opportunity matrix. And the idea, we borrowed some jargon, some language from the discipline of economics, and we call this the reconciliation of the supply of science and demand for science. So it's RSD, trying to connect it. So on the demand side, can the user benefit from research? Yes or no. On the supply side, is the relevant information being produced? This sets up a situation. The best situation, of course, is we have sophisticated users taking advantage of well-deployed research capabilities. Gets a star. If users need research, but it's not being produced, that's a problem. If the research is being produced, but no one's using it, that's a problem. And if there's no research and no benefit, well, that might be okay, but it also might be an unrealized opportunity. For us, this sets up 3 intellectual tasks of our community. And we do this quite well. So one task is to characterize demand. What is it that users want? What is it that users need? Another part is to characterize supply. What are we doing in the research community? What are we producing? How does that look like? This often goes under scientific assessments, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPBES. The third task is then to compare supply and demand. We call that an overlay, to see where they match up or where they don't match up. A lot of the work that's been done on what's called stakeholder science or use-inspired science is focused on these questions. And I just picked out one example. This is from Australia. You don't have to read all this, but there are literally thousands of papers out there now on best practices, success stories, failures, using different languages, different jargon, but with the idea that we can actually systematically better connect research and policy. And we saw 2 examples from projects this morning. We do this pretty well. We do this so well that we are able to identify when there's failures or shortfalls in science arbitration. One of the big challenges is, this is a term coined by my colleague Dan Sarowitz, an excess of objectivity. I'll just give an example because it's fun, but it is a fundamental challenge in reconciling supply of and demand for research. So this is an interesting study. What was done, it was an experimental study. The question was, do black soccer players get more red cards? And so as part of the study, they put together 32 different research teams. And they asked each research team to independently answer that question. And what this shows is the variables used by each. So here's 32 research teams. Here's variables: the position the player plays, their height, their weight, age, what country they come from, country of the referee, and so on. And then the variables that were used by each group to try to address this question are shaded in black. And what you can see is there's a lot of methodological diversity. We could have a debate. What's the properly specified model here? Which is more accurate? This is what we academics do. Let's jump to the, so Sarowitz says, science is sufficiently rich, diverse, balkanized to provide comfort and support for a range of subjective political positions on complex issues. So here's the results. Here's the 32 research teams. The results are if the uncertainty bar crosses the dashed line, then they found a statistically significant effect between the race of the player and getting a red card. If there was no overlap, there was no relationship. And these methods have wonderful sounding names: multi-level regression and logistic regression, 3-level hierarchical generalized linear modeling with Poisson sampling. This all sounds wonderful. So what's the answer? So my response would be, well, what answer do you want? I can give you whatever answer you want to that question. And so if you are an expert and you have to summarize this knowledge for a policymaker, what do you tell them? It's very unsatisfying. But a lot of the work that we do is characterized by multiple methods, multiple theories, a range of empirical data sets that lead to results that are perhaps a function of what result you want. So dealing with an excess of objectivity is I think, one of the most serious challenges in effective science arbitration. We could talk more about that. The issue advocate. I'll talk a bit more about this. So if you go to Google Ngrams, which allows you to search books in the English language, and you search for the phrase democratization of science, you see over the last 100 years, There's been an explosion of this term. And back in the 1990s, when it had its most recent increase, there was this idea that we researchers should be democratizing science in the sense of inviting the public in, that we want science to reflect more of society. We want people to have voices. I'm going to suggest that that promise hasn't been fulfilled as much as maybe we thought it would have been 20 years ago. So Thomas Piketty had a very interesting paper come out about a little less than a year ago, and he talks about the politics of the highly educated. Scientists, experts, highly educated, PhD recipients, highly credentialed. What I'm going to talk about is people like us, people who think that we're expert in a particular area of knowledge. And I'll just go through some of the findings here and talk about why I think they're important for how we engage in political advocacy. You don't have to read all of this, but what Piketty says is that the expansion of higher education, so post-secondary degree programs, creates new sorts of inequalities in society. Not necessarily the rich and the poor. It's different. It's the highly educated versus others. And he suggests that this suggests some difficult political cleavages in society. So what he found empirically, and this is looking at the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, that over time, the highly educated increasingly vote more left on the political spectrum and more together, that we have more uniformity of views. I won't go through all this. This is an entire talk in itself. But who are we? We are more left. We have higher incomes than others in society. We accumulate more wealth. We're more ideologically prejudiced than the general population. We are more biased in our information evaluation. We're more concentrated geographically. We're overrepresented in elected offices and small in absolute numbers. I'll just go quickly through some of the data here and explain why it's important. So this is in France. So this is education level, and this is Macron's vote share. So the more educated a person is, the more likely they were to vote for Macron. Very strong relationship. This is Brexit in the UK. So the less education that one has, the more likely they were to vote to leave the European Union. So the higher the education, the less likely. Very strong relationship. The Netherlands, the PVV far-right party. The more educated that the community was, the less likely they vote for the PVV. It's the far-right anti-Islam party. This is interesting data. This is the United States. So this is 50 states who they voted for in the 2016 election. Blue is for Hillary Clinton. This red is for Donald Trump. They're ranked from top to bottom in proportion of people with an advanced degree, so master's or PhD. Very striking relationship here, which is interesting because there's not, as I'll show in a second, there's not nearly enough people with advanced degrees to move elections, because most people don't have advanced degrees. And yet, the states in the United States with the most advanced degrees voted one way, those without voted another way. Again, this relationship seems to hold across different countries. This is in the United States. People with higher levels of education make more money. And one thing that's interesting is that the trend is much higher the more education you have than for those with less. So this is the cumulative income in the United States from 1991 through 2016 of people with only a high school education and then people with PhDs. And this is an aggregate. But if we zoom in and we set 1991 to 100, and then just look at the relative change, people with PhDs have seen their incomes increase by collectively more than 400%. One of the reasons, and I'll show an example, but there's some literature out there, why there's a cleavage in society between the elites and non-elites. It's not because people reject facts or they're anti-science. It's because the relative standing of different groups in society has changed dramatically over time, and there's social resentment. And for better or worse, in the United States at least, and I would suggest this is a hypothesis, but I think it probably holds in most Western countries, this situation is problematic for the politics of the highly educated. So in the United States, the highly educated are concentrated geographically. I come from Boulder. I am the poster child of this talk. This is the most concentrated area in the United States of people with PhD or master's degrees. But you can see it's a lot of the urban places in the United States. And we tend to group, partly because that's where research centers are co-located. Our spouses are also in similar fields. There's something called assorted mating, where people with high degrees tend to marry people with high degrees. And we self-segregate in society. Here's U.S. So this is U.S. Population in terms of high school all the way up to a doctoral degree. So as you might expect, more people have a high school degree and it drops off. But this is elected officials at the national level. Tremendous overrepresentation of, and this goes for Republicans and Democrats in the United States. Democrats and Republicans in the United States, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degrees. I was surprised to learn that there's more Republicans with advanced degrees than there are Democrats in the United States. So one of the things that we've seen is that we, highly educated, and particularly in science, have begun to flex our political muscles. We want action on different topics, whether it's energy or agriculture, food, you name the topic. We have a political voice now. So the March for Science, everyone's familiar with that. There's a lot of critique about the idea that the population is rejecting truth or science, that there's a war on science. Now in the United States, it didn't always used to be this way. So this is data from the 50 years ago, from the 1960s. This is political affiliations of US professors, 1968, behavioral science, physical science, and the fine arts. And you can see the social scientists were a bit more on the left side of the spectrum, but overall, very even across the political parties. You could say 50 years ago that people with advanced degrees looked like the political distribution of the population at large. This is a survey from the March for Science, conducted in 2 cities in the United States. And this is self-reported political affiliation of scientists. And you can see there's almost no scientists would admit to being Republicans, at least in this march. So one of the, if you look at the studies, and I think this holds for Brexit in the UK, I'm not going to show that data, but in the United States, the 2016 election, what led to Donald Trump, which people are still trying to figure out in the United States, but some empirical data suggests it was not about economic hardship. It was about dominant groups that felt threatened by change and a candidate who took advantage of that trend as positioning himself closer to his opponent than his opponent to America's position on status threat-related issues. So what this says is that the rise of Donald Trump in the United States reflects the fact that Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, which has positioned itself as the party of science, has distanced, and it's not because of science only, of course, but there's this notion that there is an elitism in the United States that was exposed by Donald Trump, who said, hey, I'm just a regular guy like the rest of you. If we look at data on whether there's a war on science or whether the population is anti-science or post-truth, this is from the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators. It's a nice publication the US government puts out every 2 years on all sorts of statistics about the state of science and public understanding. This is simply a measure of science literacy in the United States. You can't read that, but it starts in 1992. There's no indication that the American population has become stupider or dumber. The same population that elected Barack Obama elected Donald Trump with the same amount of scientific literacy. This is a little bit hard to read, but this purple, if you can see that, from 1973 is trust in institutions. And in the United States, science and scientists continues to be among the most trusted institutions across all of society.
Same in Germany.
Same in Germany. Here's the UK. Same in the UK. So the idea that experts somehow are distrusted or have fallen out of favor, it's just not represented by the evidence. There's more going on there. We are in a remarkable position in society. We have enormous trust, particularly when compared to journalists or politicians or others, pretty much anyone else across society. So this is from Art Largent, a historian of science, which I think is really important, a message, the best capturing of this that I've seen, that I think every scientist should be aware of. And this is a message to scientists. He says, "You are an intensely privileged group of people. You are revered. You have more cultural, social, economic authority than any other group. You guys are it. You possess the wheel of the largest and most powerful institution that ever existed, modern science. And you also control education systems. Your hand in the economic engine is also substantial. You're it. You're the hegemon. You're the most powerful thing. When you forget that and see yourselves as embattled scientists constantly under fire, I understand you're being harassed. I understand that you're frustrated, but it's because you have so much power and authority, and that's really a good thing. You have a responsibility. You have to be the adult in the room." Strong stuff. I'm gonna let Carson take a picture. So one of the things that we have to recognize that when we become political advocates, we might think, oh, there's so few of us scientists, and there's this population, and Brexit, and Donald Trump, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. But the reality is that from the other side, from the side of society and the population writ large, we're in control. We are in control of society. So when we go out and advocate for particular actions, we have to understand that we do so from a position of extreme authority, extreme trust, and extreme power. And with that comes a number of responsibilities for how we engage. So to conclude this part, so can the highly educated play power politics and win? And my answer is no. This is the number of people so I showed you some economic data, but this is just the number of people. Think of this as the number of voters. In the United States, this is the number of people with only high school degrees, 57 million in the United States. This is the number of people with PhDs, 4 million. In democratic systems, these people might have all the knowledge, but these people have all the votes. And that's not going to change. Not in my lifetime, probably not in your lifetime. And so when we engage in political discourse, in public policy, and we try to represent our views, our preferences, our knowledge as being that on which decisions should be made, we have to figure out, well, how do we do that in a context where most people may not share our values, they may not vote like we do. It presents, I think, a fundamental challenge of our age. All right, the honest broker of policy alternatives. Let's talk a bit about that. All right, I'm doing okay. So one of the things one of the reactions to the book, The Honest Broker, that I did not expect at all was there was a substantial criticism of the book, particularly from prominent climate scientists. And the criticism was something like this. They said, if you give someone choice, if you empower them by giving them a spectrum of options, they might make the wrong choice. All you are doing is empowering them to do the wrong thing. So what we should do as experts is take the wrong choices off the table before we give them choice, because some choices aren't acceptable. And for each one of us, I can come up with a topic for which you will want to take choices off the table. Maybe it's climate change. Maybe it's nuclear power. Maybe it's vaccination of children. There will be a topic for which you will say, no, I'm the expert. This is how it must be. So one of the things that we have to do as experts, and this is what I tell my students in my classes, at the very beginning, is to make peace with democracy. And for each of us, that will mean something different. But the strong version of that is that as experts, you accept to live in a world where the population chooses decisions that you wouldn't if you were the king or queen in charge of all decision making. And it's a very hard position to be in. And all of us will find a point where you will say, no, not acceptable. Right? And for me, the most important thing for us to do is to discuss that, put that out in the open. There are situations where you say, no, I have to be an advocate. So in the United States, in some locations, and Boulder, Colorado is one of them, there's a crisis of vaccination. So figure this out. Boulder has the most PhDs of any community in the United States, and it also has the most unvaccinated children. I am not going to say, oh, well, here's a choice. Vaccinate your kid, don't vaccinate your kid. That's just not acceptable. The choice for us is, when do we want to be overt advocates and wage an outward political campaign and do that less well or good? Or when do we want to say, okay, here's the choice. So a situation in a community might be deciding how to power their community. They could use nuclear power, wind and solar, geothermal, coal, natural gas. You could give them a spectrum. Some people will say, nope, no coal, not acceptable. If you're in West Virginia or in East Germany, you might say, all right, well, coal's okay, just until 2038. But figuring out when we give choice and when we don't is really the important question to have. There's no answer to that. It's a discussion and a debate, and it's part of the democratic system. So honest brokers, I was going to put a unicorn, but I thought that was too pessimistic. My experience has been there are organizations that do honest brokering. And the important thing is you or I, we're not, well, unless it's going to a restaurant, but individuals can't do honest brokering. Honest brokering has to be a collective act by experts in partnership with citizens to come up with a suitable range of choice. Nobody likes honest brokering, except us eggheads, policy wonks. Honest brokering, if you're a politician, honest brokering makes accountability transparent. If someone gives you choice and you're a politician, then you have to make a choice. You can't say, well, the expert told me to do it. Blame him. It's his fault. Because then it makes it very clear that you were provided with a spectrum of choice and you made that choice. For the expert, if you give a politician choice, as I said before, you're taking away your moment, your ability to say, no, you should do this. So there's a profound institutional disincentives to honest brokering. One place where I found where honest brokering is done systematically and routinely is in the US military, where decision makers always ask for and want options. They want to know what their choices are. And maybe that's because human lives are at stake. I can point to examples in the US National Academy of Sciences, in the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, where there are reports and processes that are done that are providing options, but I cannot identify an organization anywhere on planet Earth whose job is to systematically present options to decision makers in the scientific community. So it's like a white lion. They're out there, you notice them when you see them, but they're pretty rare. We use honest brokers every day. So yesterday, I used the Deutsche Bahn website to get from Frankfurt to Leipzig. It didn't tell me where I should go. Didn't tell me how much I should pay. I'm the one who asked for what my options are. It gave me those options, and I picked the option that made sense for me. Honest brokers exist out there. Travel websites are probably the best example, not so much in science. Another reason why I think honest brokering makes sense, and I'm going to talk more about this in my new book, is that there is literature out there that says that if you talk about the causal pathway from putting a policy in place and then an outcome in the real world, it tends to reduce, number one, people's certainty about what they think they know, but also their political or partisan barriers to working together. So an example of this, if I ask you, do you know how a toilet works? Right? And most people will say, yeah, I know how a toilet, I'm familiar with a toilet. Then if I ask you, draw the inside of a toilet on a piece of paper. Most people can't draw the inside of a toilet. If we were to have a conversation in the first instance with all that certainty, people would be very closed to new knowledge and different perspectives. After you're asked to draw how a toilet works, and you realize, I don't know what's inside a toilet, people are more open to a discussion. It's the same thing with policy. If you say, explain to me how food production in Africa will occur without GMOs, or with GMOs, depending on your stance, most people can't explain that either way. After you've had that conversation, then you engage in a mechanistic description of policy. It's possible to break down partisan framings of issues. This is important because honest brokering can help us with politics. That's the lesson I take from this. Similar literature, if you ask people their reasons for action, so you want action on climate change, tell me your reasons. The oceans are rising, weather's more extreme, fossil fuels produce pollution, or reasons against action. This conversation doesn't work. It just doesn't. But once people become less confident in their understanding of how policies work, they're more open to a wider range of policy options. This is difficult, particularly for us experts, because we are experts in reasons. And so when we go and engage the public, we engage in reason giving. This is why you should do X, rather than starting not with knowledge or claims or reasons, but with causal pathways for policy action. Again, honest brokering is not just empowering in a democracy, it can also facilitate a healthier politics. So the conclusion, political debate might be more productive if partisans first engage in a substantive and mechanistic discussion of policies before engaging in the more customary discussion of preferences and positions. Completely opposite to how, at least I used to, a lot of people who are experts think about the engagement process. All right, I'm going to end with a little discussion of stealth issue advocacy. I will say the so-called deficit model of science, the idea, if you just understood the facts like I understand the facts, then you would share my values or my policy preferences. It is endemic, and it continues to be found across scientific domains. I see it in many different areas. And I'll just give you a few examples. I'm not sure what to do about it because my efforts to engage in this, as Silke alluded to, haven't always been warmly received. So here, the US National Climate Assessment. This is an example. This is an example of how you take years of effort by hundreds of scientists and completely delegitimize it on the first day that it's released. US National Climate Assessment came out November last year. The headline number, this is the New York Times, this is CNN, two of the most prominent media sources in the US. Front page, upper right, no better territory in the US media world. You can't read that, but it says that climate change is going to have a 10% hit on GDP. Can't miss it, 10% hit on GDP. So where did that number come from? It came from the report. You go to the report. I'll just make this a short story. It's the most extreme value and the most extreme scenario of the impacts report from a study that was funded by a Democratic political donor in the United States and completely out of step with the physical science. This is IPCC and it was in the report. So the 10% of GDP number came, you can see the line here. So the critics of action on climate change in the United States said, oh, we can ignore this report because it's been promoted with the most extreme scenario that even the report doesn't support. This is the sort of thing that in a US context where climate change is contested, having a diverse set of groups participate in the assessment process would have caught this before it went out. Another example. So how many of you have heard 97% of scientists agree on climate change? Most people have heard this. This is Barack Obama tweeting it out. So Dan Kahan is a psychologist at Yale University, and he studied what people hear when they hear this statement made. You might think what they hear is 97%. That's not what they hear. Here's what they hear. All the social marketing of scientific consensus does is augment the toxic idioms of contempt that are poisoning our science communication environment. The unmistakable social message of the material featuring this message is that you and your people who share your identity are morons. It's not science communication. It's a clownish bumper sticker that says, can I say that here? It's still morning. It says, fuck you. So this gets back to the point where there's all of these people with high school educations in the United States. There's all these PhDs, 10% less. And that when we say this message, and this is based on Kahan's empirical research, this is what people hear. So, I mean, we may want to say that to the rest of society, but one of the things we have to be attuned to is that when we're conveying what we think is quote-unquote science communication, it can be received in very different ways. And in the United States, when climate communication is, and I know it's different in Germany, it's different in a lot of places, but when that is sent out, people actually have the opposite reaction than the one that the scientists intend. I would say the same dynamic goes on in the UK with Brexit. When the experts talk about the economic impact of Brexit, people don't hear, oh, I'm going to be poorer. They hear something more like this. So we have to be attuned to the messages we're sending and not expect that the vast majority is going to agree with it. Now, stealth advocacy often has this backlash effect. And so the remedy is to be open about our advocacy. Instead of, this message says nothing about policy, right? This is the reason giving. So, but there's an extreme resistance because you know what we're expert in? We're expert in science. We're often not experts in policy or politics. So again, like Eclipse, like other projects that we've heard about, like the work of IPBES and UFZ, figuring out how to do that engagement, not just between experts and the public, but across expertise, so that we're sophisticated about policy and politics is really important. All right, so I tried to go through some of the challenges and opportunities for assuming these different roles. It's obviously a lot more complicated. I could give a week's worth of talk on each one of them. But I think for us to be wise in how we actually bring science and decision-making together, we have to get into that level of detail. It's not just about communication. It's not just about being experts. And it's not just having concern with stakeholders. It's being deeply immersed in this really synthetic, organic process that's messy, it's political, it's sometimes very unsatisfying because the real world goes different directions than we would. But I think there's nothing more important today in democracy. That's my office right there. All right, thank you very much.